In Spokane, Washington, young women are turning up dead.
We were having a flurry of victims. The pressure of that on the detectives was pretty immense.
A police force sifts through the clues.
The big tool in this case was DNA. That individual left part of himself with most every one of those victims.
But could a respected family man have lived a double life as a serial killer?
A nice guy, very intelligent, attractive, and he paid well. He was beyond normal.
The hunt for a serial killer. This is Spokane, Washington. It's a quiet community of nearly 200,000, where computer wizards, healthcare workers, and Air Force personnel reside. But for 2 years, something strange and frightening was going on. Dead bodies of women began surfacing, one after another.
Jennifer Joseph.
Heather Hernandez.
In August of 1997, the bodies of 16-year-old Jennifer Joseph and 20-year-old Heather Hernandez were found on the very same day. In a city where the average murder rate is 5 a year, that was enough to send a chill throughout the community.
A body is found this afternoon only a mile from the shallow grave of a murder.
And sheriff's deputies uncover another dead body just south of Spokane.
There was quite a bit of terror. You know, there was a lot of fear on the part of residents who lived there.
And for Sergeant Cal Walker of the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, those two bodies raised a puzzling question.
You have to wonder right then and there, in a community our size, if something isn't connecting those two individually.
The two murders triggered the police to take a second look at other unsolved crimes.
Shannon Zielinski.
Melody Murfin.
In June 1996, the body of Shannon Zielinski had been discovered, and in May 1997, Melody Murfin had been reported missing.
It took about 4 victims, I think, into this, that finally the detectives said, wait a minute, we've got a bigger problem here.
The bodies kept turning up.
You're talking a community that has never experienced one of these types of cases.
The latest is 29-year-old Darla Sue Scott.
In November 1997, police found Darla Scott dead. The next month, the bodies of Laurel Wasson and Sean McClanahan were found on the same day. And 2 months later, in February 1998, Sonny Oster became another victim. Many of these women knew each other. They were all prostitutes and hooked on drugs. They walked the streets of East Sprague, the Skid Row of Spokane, in the downtown area.
It's a split-second decision. You just either jump in the car or you don't. It has a lot to do with how they speak to you, how they look.
Now, with the bodies of more prostitutes turning up, it seemed that someone was specifically targeting them.
We really would like the public's assistance in letting us know.
That's becoming frighteningly familiar, the bodies of young women.
They found her, I believe, in February, but she was probably had been gone since back in October.
Authorities discover a dead body just a mile away.
The body was just off the roadside underneath a pile of
leaves. This after more than a dozen prostitutes have been found murdered since 1980.
Police feared they had a serial killer on the loose.
A lot of serial killers choose prostitutes because of their lifestyle. They're a very vulnerable group. With a normal person, that normal person just doesn't jump into a car with an unknown individual, and prostitutes do that. That's how they make the money to support either themselves and their families or their drug habits.
The question now, could a serial killer have struck again?
Within just a 2-year period, 12 women had been murdered.
97 and 98, we were having a flurry of victims. And to get woke up and know when that phone rang that it was going to mean that there had been another life taken and somebody else had been found, the pressure of that on the detectives was pretty immense.
All right.
By 1998, a task force had been formed to catch the serial killer.
Let's have a briefing on what happened yesterday in the meeting.
A lot of people would think that we were able to throw hundreds of detectives at this case. If you were in Los Angeles, that's exactly what you would see. In Spokane, we were lucky to put 8.
Police estimate the woman was between 25 and 35 years old, about 5'6".
My first briefing with the Homicide Task Force, the supervisors and the detectives all told me, Sheriff, we will solve this. We're going to solve this. That was their feeling from the very beginning.
Next, the task force pieces together the clues.
Children play in a world full of dirt and germs. That's why moms who know turn to Clorox regular bleach to disinfect toys. Add 3/4 of a cup of Clorox regular bleach per gallon of water. Soak for 5 minutes.
R-O-W-G-Y.
Take time to be a dad
One more
today.
time. All those.
Every Friday.
Usually, police and prostitutes are on the opposite sides of the law. Now they had to learn to trust one another in order to catch the killer. Mark Safaric is an FBI behavioral analyst.
What the task force did was have 2 officers out there every night talking to these women.
All the victims had been sexually assaulted and shot in the head. And when their bodies were discovered, a plastic bag had been tied around the head.
Shannon Zielinski.
Sean Johnson.
Melinda Mercer.
A majority of them were left in rural sites, but at the same time we had some left right downtown, you know, a block or 2 from where they had been working. So there was a mix of where the bodies had been left. The victims were all coming from a corridor that runs through Spokane. The prostitutes that work that area normally hang out within a pretty narrow focus in a particular area. And with the amount of times that our offender would have had to go into that area, it was highly probable that he had some type of police contact.
Since East Sprague was such a small area, only 3 blocks long, detectives felt sure that one of them had seen the serial killer. Maybe the police already had him on file for a traffic ticket or for solicitation of a prostitute. Somewhere buried in those files could be clues leading to the killer.
We felt real strong that that individual's name had to be someplace in those files. So what we were trying to do was build a database where we could go out and sift through different columns of information and see how many times an individual would show up in those separate columns. And based upon the number of times they would show up, they may rise in priority as to our contact.
Police were out scouring the streets, while at the same time physical evidence from the bodies was being studied in the labs. An analysis of each victim was conducted for hairs, fibers, and any minute clues.
It's now known that we had DNA, and that was one of the biggest things that we were able to utilize in linking our victims, along with ballistic evidence and other physical things that were left with the victims at their crime scenes.
These women are really being taken off a very small area in Spokane, the Strip. So your offender is here, he's comfortable, and he's been operating for a long time. It was somebody who was living in the community who was comfortable in this area.
The profiler looked for something linking the crimes, a signature, such as the plastic bags that were tied around all the victims' heads.
As we looked at this, there was a utilitarian aspect to the bags, using the bags. You're shooting someone in the head, then you can keep blood from getting in different locations by using bags. And so that was one very critical aspect, I think, of the cases.
Surprisingly, most of the bodies were not hidden, but instead were close to the road. It was as if the killer didn't care if his victims were found.
So the question is, why is he not concerned about these victims being discovered? And really the answer is because he doesn't believe that he can be linked to the victims.
So profilers believed that the killer was someone who would not normally be associated with prostitutes. This woman works an area near East Sprague.
I knew most of them out on the street. We all had children, families. They were all individuals. all different, but yet we were all the same. We were like a family. We didn't talk about addictions and tricks. Mainly we talked about our families.
The serial killer was a constant subject. It was always on women's minds. One woman said, if he picks me up, you can bet that I'll leave my mark. And she carried a huge knife, probably a 10-inch knife.
A couple of girls thought they would be next. Linda Mabin talked about it. It was almost like she knew she was going to be a victim.
Even when these prostitutes were at a very heightened state of alert, they were still getting into the car with this guy, which basically told us this isn't a monster. This guy is probably very normal looking, just very average looking.
Next, the police close in on the serial killer. It was the discovery of victim Jennifer Joseph's last known whereabouts that would eventually break the case.
There was a witness early on that had seen Jennifer Joseph leaving the East Sprague area with a man in a white Corvette. That was a pretty good indicator to us that that could have been the very last car that Jennifer Joseph had ever been in.
Police compiled a list of every Corvette registered in Spokane County, eastern Washington, and northern Idaho. That information was then compared to lists in the database.
Based upon that, there were a number of names that came out on multiple lists.
Police interviewed the suspects on the list. One of them, Robert Yates Jr., an unlikely suspect, was a former military man.
2 different patrolmen at some period of time had had contact with Mr. Yates, once in the white Corvette and once in another vehicle. So they had gone into a batch of intelligence information.
Yates, like the others on the list, was asked to take a DNA test, but he declined.
We then focused on his Corvette, which he had sold to another individual. We were able to find that Corvette, went and did a quick physical examination, a quick look of that Corvette, and at the same time, because of evidentiary fibers that had been recovered on other victims, decided that we would pull fibers from that particular Corvette.
The result? Fibers from the Corvette, similar to this car, matched those found on Jennifer Joseph's body. A search warrant was issued for the Corvette, and amazingly, bloodstains were still evident. And a button, like this one, believed to be Jennifer's, was discovered underneath the floorboards.
It's almost like I think she might have had a hand in somehow getting that button underneath the floorboard where it couldn't be found, because this person was meticulous about cleaning that vehicle and never found it all this time.
Once we had that definitive link to show that Jennifer Joseph's blood was found in Mr. Yates's Corvette, that gave us what we needed to pursue a warrant for DNA on Mr. Yates. But the big tool in this case was DNA. That individual left part of himself with most every one of those victims.
Preliminary results coming back from the lab have identified Mr. Yates as our suspect.
Has Yates confessed?
No, he has chosen not to speak to us. He's been given his rights, and he's chosen not to talk to us.
On April 18th, 2000, Robert Lee Yates Jr. was arrested and charged with the murder of 16-year-old Jennifer Joseph.
Members of the Spokane Homicide Task Force announced today that they have successfully arrested the person responsible for the series of crimes in regard to the serial homicide.
Yates, a former military helicopter instructor, lived in Spokane, worked at Kaiser Aluminum, and was married with 5 children.
Sheriff, can you tell us initially what it was that led you to Yates?
The white vet was really the link to Mr. Yates.
Good evening. We begin tonight with a massive police investigation
Robert
into the
Yates
murder.
Jr. is in the Spokane County Jail this evening.
Spokane man is arrested for killing a prostitute.
Robert Yates's arrest was for a single homicide, but police believed he had been responsible for many more murders.
A Spokane man is being called Spokane serial killer. It's the break Spokane authorities have been waiting for.
Where 47-year-old Robert Lee Yates is being held on murder charges.
His arrest stunned the community, including a woman who once dated Yates.
I was sitting on a bar stool next door and was watching the news, having a drink, when his picture came on the news, and I almost fell off my bar stool.
It was huge. There wasn't a day that went by that I didn't hear, if not in here, then on the street, somebody talking about Robert Lee Yates.
Yeah. Oh, I can't even make one.
A couple of people that I talked to said he always struck them as a good neighbor. He played catch with his son.
But to the families of his victims, Robert Yates Jr. was a murderer.
No matter what their lifestyle was, and they made some bad choices, there's no denying that. Nobody deserved to be treated like some garbage out somewhere that somebody just decides, well, your life's not worth anything, we're just going to go ahead and take it, then I'm just going to discard you somewhere.
He looked very normal, and I just looked at him, and I said to myself, probably why, you know, what makes somebody like an animal? He's an animal. I mean, he's not really a human being.
To the women of East Sprague, he was very human. So much so, they looked forward to him coming around.
I think it's shaken most of the women who dated him, because women out on the streets survive by gut instinct. We talk about that a lot. You know, listen to your gut, listen to your heart. If it tells you not to get into a car, believe it, don't do it.
He was beyond normal. Maybe that should have been my first clue. A nice guy, very intelligent, attractive, and he paid well. I'm suffering from an acute case of survivor guilt because I was one of the lucky ones. He picked me up on the street for a date. We dated, and he gave me his phone number at work at Kaiser. I called him several times at Kaiser. I had more of a relationship with him than most of the other girls.
The two even discussed who they thought the Spokane serial killer could be.
He thought it was somebody on the police force. I, on the other hand, thought it might be a cab driver because they're less likely to be conspicuous, you know. They're out there every day. I never would have guessed in a million years it was him. It makes it a lot harder for me, though, because I was starting to have some feelings for the man. I used to be able to trust my own judgment, and I can't do that anymore.
How is it that you can go out, sexually assault and brutalize a victim and kill her, and 20 minutes later walk into your house like nothing's happened?
Next up, the double life of Robert Lee Yates Jr.
Keep your feet off the ground. Zach, watch out. Don't swing while she's swimming.
With the arrest of a suspect in the Spokane serial killings, everyone was asking, who is Robert Lee Yates Jr.?
The fact that he's married and has children, for most people, is too uncomfortable. He's just a little bit too much like me. Lives in a house, has a job, he's married, has children.
From all appearances, Robert Yates Jr. was an unlikely serial killer. Married for 26 years, he had 5 children, ranging in age from 10 through 25. The arrest shocked his father, who knew a very different Robert Yates.
He did like to take his children hunting, camping mainly. They were too young to hunt. On his leisure time, he liked to go to ball games, and like baseball game, that's mainly what he liked.
Yates grew up here on Whidbey Island, some 30 miles from Seattle. He had lived in the town of Oak Harbor.
Bobby grew up a happy little kid, you know, and as he grew up, we got into sports more heavily, and I coached him 2 or 3 different times. He did better than average at school. He had a lot of boyfriends that they hiked together, and he was a great outdoorsman. We hunted and fished together and hiked in the mountains.
The family were Seventh-day Adventists and active in the church. When it burnt down, the Yateses, including 16-year-old Robert Jr., pitched in to build a new one. Al Gaddy has been Yates's friend since childhood.
When my mother passed away, his mother took me under her wing. So I was like his brother. I was part of the family. They went to church every weekend, but they also lived that type of life too. I never heard them cuss. I never even heard them raise their voice. There wasn't any alcohol in the family, no smoking. You know, they were a clean living family.
In high school, Yates was a star baseball player. He sang in the choir and acted in school plays. In 1974, he married Linda Brewer, and they lived in Walla Walla, Washington, where he was a guard at the state penitentiary. The job didn't last long, and neither did the several jobs that followed. In 1976, Yates joined the Army, and that's where he seemed to have found his niche. He loved flying helicopters and became so good at it that he became a teacher's teacher and taught pilots how to teach flying. Throughout his 18-year military career, Yates had a distinguished record. While stationed in Germany, his family joined him.
His whole family went over there with him, and he was there for 3 years or so.
He also served in Fort Drum, New York, Fort Rucker, Alabama, Haiti, and Somalia.
If you talk to the Army and about his record in the service, you know, he's an outstanding person. The military couldn't believe what he did. You know, they said he was one of their top instructors.
In 1996, Yates quit the military and moved his family back to Washington and settled in Spokane. And that's when the string of murders began appearing. Police records show that in 1998, Yates was stopped by police for having a known prostitute in the car. He told police it was his daughter's friend and he was driving her home. And then, 2 days later, his 19-year-old daughter came to the county jail to report her father for hitting her. He was charged with misdemeanor assault.
He was a strict dad. Kids grew up when he was in the service, and he was very much of a disciplinarian, and I thought that he was a little bit too tough on his children at times.
From police interviews with family members, a very different picture of Yates came into focus.
Domineering, abusive emotionally, abusive physically, ran the house sort of with an iron hand, and really a different person at home than he was, you know, outside. Emotionally distanced from them as well. And none of this really surprises us.
The news of Yates's arrest on April 18, 2000 sent his family reeling.
I only heard about the bodies the day he got arrested. Bobby's father-in-law called me and he said, Bob, your son has been arrested for killing a prostitute, been charged with killing a prostitute. So, man, my world just turned upside down.
We cry about it every day, every day. I think it's the worst thing that ever could happen to any family.
The question is Robert Yates, who lives on this street, connected to one murder and maybe more?
As police were picking up Yates, other officers whisked Linda Yates and her children to an undisclosed location. There, friends, family, and police cared for them.
I'm convinced Mrs. Yates did not have a clue what her husband was doing. A lot of people ask me, how can that be? There was nothing that would have led her to believe that her husband was involved in something like that. And again, she's as much a victim in this as some of the other, as our other ladies.
For 1 month following his arrest, police painstakingly searched the Yates home and yard, looking for forensic evidence that would link him to other murders.
We want a mountain of evidence when we take this into the courtroom. We're going to go in with the best evidence that we can present the trier of fact in this case.
You're talking about going through every person's clothes, looking for fibers off of those clothes. The transfer of those fibers, how could it occur? Could our offender, Mr. Yates, have had a hug with one of his daughters and picked up a fiber and then transferred that fiber to his victim during the time? So we couldn't just look at his clothes. We had to look at her, Mrs. Yates's clothes, and 5 kids' clothing items that were packed into that house.
In addition, forensic biologists discovered that the plants growing in Yates's yard were the same vegetation found on or near his victims. Exactly why Yates transported the plants is still a mystery.
Mr. Yates, with one particular victim, had gone over and raked up a certain area of the yard, gathered that up, transported the victim and the vegetation, and dumped that. The next victim would have another series of plants, different and with particular leaves from other trees, out of the different areas in the backyard.
It was just so shocking that it was just beyond imagination.
And there was never, ever an inkling?
Not one. that I could think of that could have caused him to take this turn. I can't think of any incident.
But it's possible that a 40-year-old secret could have played a part in his son's actions.
He had been molested when he was 6 years old by a 12-year-old boy, 11 or 12-year-old boy. And Linda told me about it. I says, I never did ever hear about it. I said, I didn't have a clue that that ever went on, you know. I asked Bobby about it at that time. Yes, he said it happened. But he told me that he didn't know why that would make a difference in his life, you know. But it certainly could have, you know.
I guess, you know, if you killed 13 people or 14 people, if you were really, really remorseful, why would you kill another? I don't think he understands actually what he's done.
Coming up, Robert Yates faces the families of his victims. Even though the world saw these women as prostitutes and drug addicts, their families had quite a different view.
Sean McClenahan.
She was just accepted into a methadone program, and she feels that her life is finally on the up and up. And she says to update the rest of the family and let them all know that she's alive. And then she dies about, what, 3 weeks later.
Jennifer Joseph.
If you really want to talk about something that's very hard, is write your obituary for your 16-year-old daughter. Jennifer was a person that liked to laugh, and she was happy. She liked her music, and she was a pretty good girl, really. The apple of her father's eye.
Sonny Oster.
Today I went walking, as I often do, and I started thinking of you. My steps grew faster and faster. You see, I felt you were looking right at me. I looked up into the clouds, and out came a gleam of light. I said, "Follow me home, Sonny. It'll be all right."
Another prostitute might have been a victim, but she escaped just in time. Christine Smith had been picked up by Yates in this van, seen here on amateur video. It wasn't until she saw the serial killer's picture in the newspaper that she identified Yates as the man who tried to kill her.
That was a very important surprise to the detectives in this task force, to get a call from somebody that's identified this person as, you know, and what he did. So we may get a little more insight onto how these other victims were treated and how they died.
1 month after his arrest, Yates was arraigned on May 31st, 2000. By that time, police had linked him to 7 murders and 1 attempted murder. Yates entered a plea of not guilty. It was assumed the state would ask for the death penalty. But to try him for all the murders at once, the prosecution would have to prove common scheme, meaning Yates had a plan or scheme to go after one specific group.
We thought we had it, so we filed the charges. We went ahead, and then we started doing research. And I have an appellate deputy that works with me that is just excellent. And he's in computer contact with all the appellate deputies across the state. And his response back was totally against the common scheme or plan, especially in a case with 7 murders and 1 attempted murder.
For it to be common scheme or plan, Yates would have had to kill all the prostitutes he had been with. But he didn't. Even so, the prosecution was still considering going for the death penalty. Fearing that, Yates's attorney offered the prosecution a deal.
We want to keep Mr. Yates alive. We want to successfully defend him, and this is a part of that process.
In return for a life sentence, Yates would not only admit to the 8 he was charged with, but solve 6 others, some going back more than 20 years to 1975.
I knew from the investigation that we were missing 1 body, at least.
Before the deal could even be brokered, prosecutors insisted that Yates take a polygraph test, confessing to all the murders. The results indicated that Yates was telling the truth. But the polygraph test became controversial when the Spokesman Review newspaper obtained the test and sent it out to other polygraph experts.
We took that test to 2 national experts who said that, you know, the results of what we've got here, the results of this test are inconclusive, and you can't determine that this man was being truthful based on the information that you've presented us.
Police thought if they could link Yates with the other unsolved murders of prostitutes, that would strengthen the case for common scheme.
They were very angry. They made no attempt to conceal their frustration with the plea agreement.
We had some real mixed emotions about that. And I think the majority of law enforcement had a feeling that with this type of offender and with the number of victims associated with this individual, if you don't use the death penalty here, where do you use it?
In the meantime, the prosecutor wasn't going to make any deal without talking to the victims' families.
We polled them one at a time, individually, about how they stood on the death penalty or life without chance of parole. And the tally that I have has 19 people for life in prison and 12 for death.
Are you ready to proceed?
We are.
They purposely left their best case out of the agreement in case the plea bargain fell through.
We took our best case and dismissed it. It has fingerprints, it has DNA, it has ballistics, and that case can be brought back by the agreement for the death penalty.
The case is the murder of Sean McClenahan, age 39, found dead in December 1997. That decision didn't sit well with her family.
For me, as I said, I'm very angry because it's, to me, saying she never was. There was nothing worthwhile to her life.
As part of the plea agreement, Yates had to confess to 6 additional murders, and it shocked police and prosecutors. 2 of these murders went as far back as 1975, with the murders of Patrick Oliver and Susan Savage of Walla Walla, Washington. The third, the 1988 murder of Stacy Hahn in Skagit County, and then 2 unsolved murders in Spokane. Shannon Zielinski in 1996 and Heather Hernandez in 1997. Now, all that was needed was the 6th victim, Melody Murphin, who had been missing since 1997.
She's the one body we're missing. If it's not her, then there's no agreement.
Yates drew police a map to her grave.
We were prepared for an outdoor type of setting somewhere in the woods, as we had been so many times with this investigation. And it was a huge surprise for us to be led right back to the Yates home.
No one could have ever imagined that Yates would be so bold as to bury one of his victims in his own front yard.
Go back to his residence and find that body buried underneath one of those particular flower beds was pretty impacting on every single person. We had spent so much time there thinking that we had covered each and every square inch.
You know, we have all this money and all this time put into this task force, and they didn't find her when they scanned the yard the first time, nor the second time. I went a long time without my mother. And then to have him say, she's in my yard, 4 feet under, or, you know, it was very disturbing. Couldn't believe that.
One of the most interesting things to the investigators was that Melody Murphin was buried right outside the headboard of his bedroom.
I asked him, you know, I said, now how can you sit there and you go to bed and make love to your wife at night with this, you know, this body down below your bedroom window? He goes, it was nothing like that. He says, no, it was back in the corner and it was 3 feet deep. And apparently it was wrapped in plastic and all that kind of stuff.
Police were anxious to question Yates, but because of the plea agreement, prosecutors had no leverage to make him talk about his methods or motives.
He did look like a regular guy.
For the families looking for answers, this was a bitter pill to swallow, even though they understood that the agreement led to solving 6 murders. Still, they can't accept that Yates, in the end, determined his own destiny.
Count 1, 20 years. Count 2, 20 years.
Why did we have to give that sick man a plea bargain to find my mother? They searched many times, and they didn't find her. you know, and now because they didn't find her, he gets to live. How can you kill so many women and still be able to live?
Next, Robert Yates talks to the families of his victims.
Would you stand, please?
In a packed courtroom on October 26, 2000, Robert Lee Yates Jr. stood and faced the families of his victims.
To the charge of murder in the first degree as set forth in count 1, victim of Susan P. Savage, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honor.
Patrick Oliver, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honor.
Stacy E. Hahn, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honor.
Shannon Zielinski, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honor.
Yates pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 1 attempted murder.
Heather L. Hernandez, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honor.
Jennifer A. Joseph, how do you plead?
Guilty, Your Honor.
Then, for the first and last time, Robert Yates spoke to his victims' families.
Nothing I can say will erase the sorrow, the pain, and the anguish that you feel and that I've caused in your lives. I've caused much sorrow, much pain. You can't know how much pain I know I've caused for all of you and my family. I've taken away the love, the compassion, and the tenderness. To the family and friends of Shannon Zielinski, I am sorry. To the family and friends of Heather Hernandez, I am sorry. To the family and friends of Jennifer Joseph, I am sorry.
Yates went down the list of his victims and apologized to each of their families.
To the friends and family of Darla Scott, I am sorry. To the friends and family of Sonny Oster, I am sorry. To the family and friends of Sean Johnson, I am indeed very sorry.
He also told them he had found God.
In my struggle to overcome my guilt and shame, I have turned to God.
Sir, why did you do it then?
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Okay, ma'am, please be seated.
The families took the opportunity to speak directly to Yates.
I want him to sit in prison the rest of his life in a little tiny 3x3 maybe room with all the pictures of these dead girls so he can look at them and remember what he did.
Your Honor, I still cannot believe that a brutal murderer like the Spokane serial killer can plea bargain to save his life. Who was there to plea bargain for my daughter Jennifer and all the other daughters and a son that were brutally murdered and left like garbage?
I know the remorse and sorrow you feel is for yourself and not the countless women you so cruelly murdered.
The main question is why did she have to die? He had no right to take her life. And I hope you rot in hell.
I had great remorse for them. I felt right along with them, having all these other losses I've had. So I felt so bad for them.
You're a sick monster, and you will be judged.
You've murdered my brother, and you don't deserve to live.
God will not forgive you, Mr. Yates. You killed my mom.
Then, Robert Yates Jr.'s daughter, Sasha, and her grandfather addressed the court.
I feel immensely terrible that this happened. It feels like a dream. I'm still in shock. It just makes me mad that this happened to so many people. They didn't deserve this. No one deserves to be killed like that. No one. Thank God I have my grandfather here with me. I'm standing here shaking, still thinking about it, imagining their faces, how they feel about us, how much they probably hate us.
Finally, the courtroom became still as Robert Yates Jr. was sentenced to a total of 408 years without parole.
You will live with the thoughts of all of these deaths for the rest of your life.
But it's not all over for him. Yates must face even more murder charges, this time in Pierce County, where prosecutors had rejected the plea agreement. Yates will now stand trial for the murders of Connie LaFontaine Ellis and Melanie Mercer. Their bodies were discovered near Fort Lewis in Tacoma in Pierce County, where Yates did National Guard duty. Prosecutors have asked for the death penalty. Yates has pleaded not guilty.
We determined that there were not sufficient mitigating circumstances to merit leniency, and this morning we served notice to Mr. Yates and to his counsel that we would seek the death penalty.
But Yates claims he's confessed to all the murders he's committed. The police don't believe him.
There are more bodies out there. There are more victims. We've got some blood stains that right now are unaccounted for. And so we've got a lot of work to do over the next year.
And authorities all over the country with unsolved murders are looking to see if Yates can be linked to any of them. One such case is that of the 1995 murder of a transvestite who worked as a prostitute near Fort Rucker in Alabama. Robert Yates was stationed there in 1995. Another is near Fort Drum in Watertown, New York. Yates was stationed there as well. While the case of the Spokane serial killer is now solved, police still feel left in the dark. There are too many unanswered questions.
But the biggest thing is, why? What made him do what he did? How did it happen? Why did it happen? And I think that's the same questions that the family has. How did he get from being a well-respected career military guy, helicopter pilot, to where he is now thought of in a whole different light, a serial killer? And I think he is the person that can answer those questions.